Wildfires are tearing through North America and Europe right now, and the smoke tells a bigger story. Did decades of fossil fuel industry cover-ups and government inaction cause this climate change crisis? We look into the leaked documents, the policy failures, and the land management mistakes behind today's mega-fires, and why the real answer is more complicated than either side admits. Right now, as you're watching this, wildfire smoke is drifting across 2 continents. In July 2026 alone, Duluth, Minnesota, a city that once marketed itself as a climate haven, recorded an air quality index over 3 times higher than what's considered hazardous. Spain declared a national emergency. Thousands fled their homes in France. And in Canada, smoke from more than 100 fires blanketed the northern US in an orange haze that made the sun look like it belonged on Mars. This isn't a freak year. Global wildfire burn area in just the first half of 2026 is already more than 50% above the recent average. So here's the uncomfortable question this video is going to sit with. Are we watching decades of industrial-era neglect finally come due? Or is that too simple a story? Let's dig in. Before we dig in, if you enjoy nuanced, evidence-based breakdowns of the biggest stories in science, history, and geopolitics, consider subscribing. It really helps the channel, and it means you won't miss future deep dives like this one. Start with what we now know companies knew. Internal research from major oil companies, uncovered through litigation and journalism over the past decade, shows their own scientists were modeling global warming from fossil fuel combustion with real accuracy as far back as the 1970s and 80s. At the same time, the public-facing message from those same companies leaned hard into uncertainty. The science isn't settled. More research is needed. If the internal documents are accurate, that's not a gap in understanding. That's a gap between what was known internally and what was said publicly. Then there's the policy side. Governments in the US and Europe had real tools on the table decades ago. Carbon pricing, stricter emission standards, land use reform. Some going back to the Kyoto Protocol, which is an international treaty that set legally binding rules to cut greenhouse gas emissions in the late 1990s. Fossil fuel lobbying, campaign financing, and a well-documented revolving door between industry and regulators are all factors historians and journalists point to in explaining why those tools got watered down or delayed for 20, 30 years. And there's a land management story that's easy to miss. In the American West specifically, a century of policy that said, put out every fire immediately, let dead wood and undergrowth pile up in forests that had evolved to burn periodically in smaller, manageable fires. That's not an emissions problem, that's a direct policy choice, and it may be just as responsible for today's mega-fires as the warming itself. Put it together and you get real asymmetry. Canada's 2023 wildfire season is estimated to have contributed to roughly 82,000 deaths across Canada, the US, and Europe from smoke and toxin exposure alone, largely borne by ordinary people, renters, outdoor workers, people near fire-prone land, while the profits from decades of fossil fuel extraction went somewhere else entirely. Here's the pushback worth taking seriously. Attribution science is real, but it's rarely simple. The severe fire seasons we're seeing now come from several factors stacking on top of each other: a warmer ocean, a hotter atmosphere, dry spells, and stubborn high-pressure systems that trap heat in place. Climate change loads the dice, but it isn't rolling every fire by itself. Most individual fires still start the same way they always have: human ignition, whether that's arson, equipment failure, downed power lines, or land management. climate change makes those fires spread faster and burn hotter once they start. It's rarely the spark itself. Natural cycles matter too. A potential super El Niño is intensifying this year's fire season on its own timeline, independent of the long-term warming trend. Some of what feels like an ever-worsening pattern is genuine year-to-year weather variability, layered on top of the slower climate trend. Not every bad season is proof the trend itself just got worse. And the villain framing, however satisfying, can flatten a genuinely hard collective action problem. Consumer demand for cheap energy, voter resistance to carbon taxes, and the sheer physical difficulty of decarbonizing an entire global economy fast are real constraints, not just a cover-up by a handful of executives. Plenty of serious historians and scientists see this less as a deliberate conspiracy to cause wildfires and more as a tragedy of the commons, a case where everyone's individual choices added up to a collective disaster nobody specifically engineered. That view can hold at the same time as agreeing the gap between internal fossil fuel research and public messaging was genuinely deceptive. Deception about the warming trend doesn't mean anyone was plotting the fires themselves. Both things can be true at once. There is real documented evidence that early warnings were downplayed for profit and political convenience. That part of the chickens coming home to roost story holds up. And at the same time, the full picture includes decades of poor land management choices, a genuinely difficult global coordination problem, and natural climate variability that would be making some of this worse no matter who was in charge of an oil company. That distinction actually matters for what happens next. If you only blame the emissions, you miss that better forest management, buried power lines, and smarter zoning could meaningfully cut fire risk within a few years. No global treaty required. If you only blame the weather, you miss that the last 40 years of policy delay were, in fact, a choice, not an inevitability. The fires burning right now aren't just a weather story. They're the visible edge of a much longer argument about who gets to profit from risk and who gets stuck paying for it when that risk finally shows up on their doorstep, sometimes literally. Whatever you conclude about blame, the smoke in the air this summer is a fact everyone downwind now has to live with. If this kind of deep dive into the systems behind the headlines is your thing, subscribe and let me know in the comments which side of this debate you land on.